Kate Mila Falcher. Welcome to Irishgrannyhelen. And sorry for my sort of absence. I was taking a little sabbatical just to decide how I wanted to move forward. And I'm happy to tell you that I'm going to continue doing our Saturday books. Some of the subject matter may be a little different, but don't worry, they'll be good. Also, I thought I'd do a little true crime. I had quite a response. I haven't had time to answer my comments, but I noticed a lot of people kind of wanted to reinvestigate the crime on YouTube comments. And I just want you all to know that when I cover a case, it's for the benefit of just covering the case. I'm not out to solve anything. We did the case of Darlie Routier, and my impression, as well as the impression of a number of experts, is that she probably deserves another trial simply because the egregious way in which her trial was handled. No judgment. I'm not the judge, I'm not the jury. I do think that the trial was mishandled, and there's concrete reason to feel that way. I'm not going to get into all the arguments people were putting out there. I think it's great that there's an interest in this. I was a little surprised. And if you have crimes that you're interested in me looking at, let me know. But I'm not a private eye. I'm not a detective. I don't work for GEDmatch, the genealogy DNA people. I don't work for the FBI. I'm just interested. And there'll be a little more about Darlie on Substack behind the paywall. Having said that, there are other topics I'd like to cover, and they're going to be more distracting and lighthearted, sometimes philosophical. But everybody knows how much I love books, and my love for reading began when I was young. I wasn't an early reader comparatively, but I dove in at first. And I have a real fondness in my heart for certain authors. And it's been a great distress to me that I've saved a lot of books from when I was little or bought them as I was an adult. And some of them, my children just refuse to let their children read. Let me give you an example. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. I loved Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle when I was a kid, but apparently she's not perhaps as sensitive to social issues as she may be today. So they didn't want their children to read it. The woman I'm going to talk about today almost falls into that category. So keep in mind the time period in which she was born and when she wrote, and consider the great gift she gave to us, because I know myself, I learned so much from her. I'm speaking about Lois LENSKI. As an author, she was known as Lois LENSKI, and I'm going to show you a few books, and you'll, I'm sure, recognize her artwork because she illustrated her own books. She was born October 14th, 1893. She was number 4 of 5 children. Her father was a Prussian clergyman and theologian. Her mother was a teacher, and they were in Ohio. And I think that's significant right away. Almost turn of the century Ohio. We're talking a wave of new Americans. So she grew up in a small town, and she had a real talent for art, which was encouraged by her parents. She commuted to high school by train because of where they lived. She did graduate from Ohio State University in 1915, so already this is remarkable, with the Bachelor in Education, a teaching certificate, and a minor in fine arts. So lucky her, came from a family that encouraged their daughters to be educated. She got a scholarship to the the Art Students League in New York. This is part of the American Fine Arts Society in Manhattan. It's not a degree program, but it is instruction, and it keeps collections of students and faculty works. Its motto is Nulla dies sine lineae, which is no day without a line. She was able to draw and engage in her art every single day, and this was a rarity for women at the time. In 1920, she went to London to Westminster School of the Arts, and in 1921, she went to Italy. Then she returned to the United States and married a guy called Arthur Covey, who was a widower and had 2 small children. He was a muralist. He did industrial workers doing their jobs. And there's more about this in a minute, but sometimes in buildings that now are old, and many of them no longer extant, often government buildings, you'll see murals on the walls of people working at everyday jobs, and often these were the kinds of things that Covey did. In 1929, they had a son together named Stephen, and they moved to a 1790 farmhouse in Connecticut. Her husband thought that women should do all the housework and the child care, and he gave her very little leeway for her creative outlet, which would maybe have really done some women in, especially having had so much freedom as a kid. But it empowered her. She drew from her own and her children's childhoods for her first books. She started writing children's books. And she's famous, and I can't show you the one I had because I gave it to my grandson. She's famous for the Mr. Small series of books, and she fashioned them after her son and his friends. She wrote her first historical novel, Phoebe Fairchild, for kids. And her book was inspired by the life that she had heard about, the historical life in the farmhouse where she lived. She imagined what the 1830s would be like. I don't think I have that book. Let me check. No, I don't. She wrote a lot of books, and they're getting harder and harder to find. Whenever I saw them at Goodwill or library book sales, I would grab them, but they're very hard to find. So because the doctor advised her for her health, they began to spend the winters in Los Angeles and Florida. I'm sorry, not Los Angeles, Louisiana, LA, Louisiana and Florida. She saw the stark social and economic differences in the regions, and compared that similar experience of poverty and the disparity in wealth from her childhood in the Midwest and then again in the Northeast with her new home. And she was sensitive to the socioeconomic and cultural differences in the different regions of the country. Now keep in mind, pre-internet, pre-TV, pre-radio for most people, virtually no telephones, very few, terrible roads, and not a lot of cars. The trains were there, of course, but communication between areas of the country was really limited. And you see it less and less these days. I remember when I was a kid and you would watch television and there would be people from different parts of the country being interviewed. Their accents were starkly different. And, you know, there's still some of that, for sure. But it's in no way as remarkable, as acute a difference as it was even 50, 60 years ago. So she got really interested in these regional differences, and she began to write books about the lives of children in different regions. And there were interruptions in her work because of her illness. She was in poor health, And in the 1950s, she started really getting into it and wrote about regional children's experiences until 1968. So she was taking historical, cultural, and socioeconomic facts and fashioning them into this tapestry of children's lives. And I just know the fondness I feel for her books. As a child, I learned so much about the United States. My family was not from here. My parents were very well read, and they probably knew all this stuff, but it wasn't something that came up in casual everyday conversation. And I don't remember it being particularly important in school, but I feel like I learned so much about the different regions of this country from Lois LENSKI. She moved to, she and her husband built a house in Tarpon Springs in Florida and went there for half the year because of her health, but they moved there permanently. She moved there permanently when he died in 1960. She won many honors, many medals, and honorary doctorates. She died in September 11th of 1974. But now we're going to look at her career a little more closely. Her first goal, her first love was art. She was a painter. And in 1927, she was shown in the Way Gallery in New York, and that's spelled W-E-I-G-H-E. In 1932, she was really into watercolors, and they were shown at the Farragil's Gallery. She became an illustrator to support herself. Her first job that she ever got as an illustrator was doing a coloring book. She did 3 books of paper dolls between 1918 and 1919. Does anybody else remember paper dolls? I loved paper dolls. Does anybody remember the Betsy McCall paper dolls in the back of McCall's magazine? I was so into that. In London, when she went there for school, she illustrated new editions of Kenneth Grahame. He's the guy who wrote The Wind in the Willows. In the 1920s in the United States, she illustrated folk tales and fairy tales, and you can still see her art in reproductions of books. One of the books that she wrote and illustrated was a book of nursery rhymes, and I'm sure it would look familiar to people. Her first original book was The Skipping Village, and in 1932, The Little Family. Remember Mr. Small? Well, The Little Family was part of that. This was the first book ever made sized for small hands, so you can kind of regard it as the first toddler's book, first little kid's book, like maybe pre-kindergarten. And not till the mid-40s, she illustrated other authors' books as well as her own. I should have brought them in here. I didn't bring them in. Some of the books she illustrated, which I loved these books, were the Betsy, Tacy, and Tib books by Maud Hart Lovelace. Well, Lois LENSKI did all the artwork for those books. Another great series of books about little girls living in the late 1800s. I'm trying to remember the outfits. I think late 1800s in, I want to say Milwaukee or Minnesota. I mean, it's been 60 or 70 years since I've looked at them. So she also did Hugh Lofting's Dr. Dolittle. She focused on child's experience in their own hometown and in other historical periods or other geographical areas. So Phoebe Fairchild, which was her first children's novel, is about a little girl who went into culture shock when she was sent to live with her Puritan relatives. So 1830s, she was sent to live with these relatives who were, as you can imagine, Puritans were like. She did great research. Her books were so well researched. She did archival, physical, material, cultural, speech patterns. and then with the broader social and historical context. She was very inspired by visiting the South, and she began her regional series. And this is why, in some cases, people are a little put off by some of her books, and I'll show you here in a minute what I mean. She gave a very unblinking portrait of what life was like for people, and in their regional dialect. And so some of the words, I don't think I need to say what I'm trying to say here. Some of the words that she used, especially from the South, would never be put, please God, in children's books today. But these serve a vital role. They're not meant to be derogatory. They're not meant to be aspersions against any people or places. What they are a reflection of what that life was like. And I think that there's a lot of value to that, to see what it was really like. So when I first started reading some of her regional books, it was hard because it was a dialect. It's oftentimes very difficult to understand, but when you got into the rhythm of it, you became completely immersed, just completely drawn in, and got a real feel for what that might have been like. She traveled extensively to research her books. She wanted to introduce American children to the various regions of America that were so separated. So she won Newberry Awards, and Newberry Awards, that wonderful award for children's literature that has the gold seal on the front of the cover, and you knew if you found a book with that gold seal, you were in for a treat. And so her first one was Bayou Suzette, which was about a little girl who was a Cajun, lived in Louisiana. And I happen to have that book. Unfortunately, these are ancient, there's no cover, but let me show you what it looked like. Bayou Suzette. And let me see if I can find, here's just one sentence. This little girl is talking to her mother. She says, "Here, no, maman, he ain't fell in the bayou. He's safe by Suzette." So it takes some familiarity with it to become comfortable with it, but just imagine what this does for children's imagination. Now imagine you're living in suburban Southern California. Remarkable book. And it won the Newberry Award, which is the top prize for children's books in the United States. Then she made another one that got, I thought I had it. Apparently not. Blue Ridge Billy, who lived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and that's a whole other series of accents. It's about a little boy in North Carolina in the mountains who's musical. Then she did Judy's Journey, and Judy's Journey was such a revelation to me because it's about a little girl who belongs to a migrant worker's family. And this is in the Dust Bowl period. Let's see if I can find a picture. There aren't a lot of illustrations. Oh, here we go. So these are children, migrant workers, and what the life was like for children doing that. Then she wrote one of her more controversial books, I think, just given the nature of the topic, Cotton in My Sack, about a little girl who worked cotton fields. So keep in mind, this is after, ostensibly, the end of slavery. It's like in the 30s, but there were so many migrant workers. Trying to find a good picture that gives you a sense. So here they are at like the little regional store. And little things like that make a big difference with kids when you're introduced to, oh, I'm sorry, I left my heater on and it is noisy. I'll turn it off here. Where's my Sorry about that. It's freezing cold here today. And you know, I was horrified to know. This is my first real introduction to the fact that small children labored in the fields. So, you know, there's value to this knowledge that she provided. It's about Arkansas sharecroppers. Then she did a whole series called Roundabout America, and these were, so she had the small books for little kids, and then Roundabout America was a whole series for children aged about beyond picture books and before they were able for the regional stories, so like early grade school. And then the last one was Deer Valley Girl, about in northern Vermont, about an animal welfare child who supported animal welfare against hunters in this very small community. The government got interested in what they were doing too, you know, during World War II, the New Deal, not World War II, before World War II, the New Deal. FDR hired a lot of writers to go around regionally and do these sorts of illustrations, both the drawing and the written, of what life was like in different parts of the country. So she got really interested in writing down songs, and she collaborated with Clyde Bula on a book of hymns and 2 songbooks. So you might find, if you go to a certain kind of church, and I don't know which denomination, you might find hymns written by Lois LENSKI. And she wrote poems as well, in poems and some samples of songs in her regional books. She wrote 3 plays with Bula about migrant families after researching Judy's journey. She joined the Division of Home Missions of the National Council of Churches. This is an ecumenical group, and worked with African American, Tejano, and displaced migrant Kentucky coal miner families, just helping them. Her use of dialect and her interest in regional research is considered to be documentary realism. I mean, she is honored in historical circles. She wasn't afraid to give a real clear-eyed representation of poverty, economic and social instability, community violence, childhood problems. She said she didn't want to paint a false picture. She said, we need to know our country better, other regions where people are different from ourselves, different races, faiths, cultural backgrounds. When we know them and understand how they live and why, we will think of them as people, human beings like ourselves. She promoted empathy and social and emotional growth to children. And she said to children, all people are flesh and blood and have feelings like themselves, no matter where they live, or how simply they live, or how little they have. Man's material comforts should not be the end and object of life. People's character, who are guided by spiritual values, come often from simple surroundings and are worthy of our admiration and emulation. Her books are called grim by some modern critics. And I would say, yeah, you know, when I read them as a child, I was dealing with my own, you know, issues. And actually, they were reassurance that people are resilient, and people faced many obstacles early in their lives. And remember, I grew up in a time where the only images we saw in popular culture of children's lives, you know, were Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver and the Brady Bunch. How real were they? So some people think that she was too grim about marginalized groups. So it's quite apparent from her life that that's not how she felt. She's aligned with progressive librarians and educators, and she's very well respected by librarians. Her realism increased social awareness. Today, some find fault with her naive and simplistic happy endings, but these are children's books too. You can't be grim and have two happy endings, too much happy ending at the same time. That's inconsistent. She's criticized for the interactions between the Native Americans in her books, and I think that's a legitimate criticism. However, consider the source, the time and place. The American Indian in children's literature group, Dr. Debbie Reese in 2006 criticized her. That's where that criticism comes from, directly from the Native Americans. And I think it's fair. I think it's an apt characterization of people's blindness to some things, but she tried, and I think she deserves a lot of credit for the good work she did do. Both things can be true at the same time. People are complicated. Nobody's all good and all bad. She died on September 11th, 1974, at the age of 80. And of course, there were a lot of controversies after she died about, for example, her book, Mary Jemison, Indian Captive, which has been criticized for making whiteness special. This is about a young girl who was kidnapped by Native Americans and then what happened to her. It mischaracterizes the appearance and Native names. You know, they gave her a Native name, and it's considered a bit, I wouldn't use the word romanticized, fictionalized a bit. So it's a stereotype of Stoic natives and how the natives learned compassion from this little white girl because they were really, in their culture, rather warlike and cruel. And I think we have to acknowledge that this is a legitimate critique. But like I said, nobody is all good or all bad, and I think some of these books that she did are just so remarkably great, so I thought I'd show them to you because I'm so proud of my little collection. This is from Roundabout America, Berries in the Scoop, and I believe this is about a little girl. I haven't read this since, I don't know, 1963, but I do believe, what does this say here? This is about a little girl in Maine. The berry bogs, the blueberry bogs in Maine. Yeah, well, I was close, Cape Cod. So let's see here. Get a picture to show you. Trying to find a picture that, and this is a poem that she immortalized, basically. You saw Cotton in My Sack, and you saw Judy's Journey. She wrote Texas Tomboy. Now, there's a title that wouldn't go over well these days. I say it as a proud feminist. Texas Tomboy. This was written in 1950. And it's all about the oil fields and ranches of Texas. And so you get a little taste of what it must have been like. I'll show you that. Then we've got We Live in the Country. This is also by Roundabout America, and it was meant for urban kids to get a taste of what country living was like. There was more of it in those days. Let's see what place. Oh, it's just farm life. A chicken farm in Connecticut, a cotton farm in Arkansas, a sheep farm in Texas, and a tree farm in Louisiana. So these are divided up into sort of short stories. Oh, here's the poor chickens being taken away. Mama Hattie's Girl, and I don't remember what this is about, but I think it's about sharecropping children, and you see what life was like for African Americans in the South, and there's music, a lot of hymns and poems in here too. San Francisco boy. It's a little boy who is of, I think, Japanese background. No, Chinese. Chinatown, of course, in San Francisco, and what that was like. I don't have, probably her most well-known book that's like, it's in paperback, it's so well-known, is Strawberry Girl. That little girl who did migrant farm work in strawberries. So this is all about California and the Chinese community in Chinatown, California. Then we have Coal Camp Girl, about a little girl living in a coal mining area. Let's see if it tells us West Virginia. And other songs, traditional songs from the coal mining area. Just so that you get a sense for, these books. I know this book sold for $4.95. Okay. This was printed in '59. And they have a whole page of definitions so that you get to understand what a tipple is, or a portal to portal, or a main holiday. And then the names of the chapters crack me up. That comment that it's grim and then it's too happy. Bucket, these are the names of the chapters. Bucket, coal, payday, hardship, pony. I can't even think about pit ponies. Winter, disaster, summer, lost, rescue, and wedding. Let's see if we can find a picture. And you know, it has interesting pictures of what coal looks like when, you know, when you bring it into your house to burn it. Okay, this one is called Boomtown Boy, and it's about the oil fields. Houseboat Girl, and I think this must be on the Ohio River, I would guess. Oh, the Mississippi. Oh, and so interesting. Look at this. Prairie School, about a sod house prairie school in the middle of nowhere in the prairies. South Dakota. And then finally, just from what I own, Shoe Fly Girl, little Pennsylvania Dutch. So I just enthusiastic about these books that I still feel a great fondness for them despite their flaws, and they're a little bit dated in the sense of how they deal with the topics, but they still hold true because they are so well researched and present so many things that might actually be harder to find now. Might be harder to find people that speak with that authentic accent and whatever. So I thought you would enjoy that, and please, I encourage you to join us on Substack. Ask Your Irish Granny. Nate and I will be working together there. I'm working there. I write, but also videos, and it's the best compromise we can come up with right now, given the situation. And I just want to remind people that some people were giving me a hard time for changing how I'm approaching things. Just like to remind people that Stephen Miller wants to revoke naturalized citizenship. So I'm operating my life under a bit more caution these days. So thank you. Thank you for coming and watching. Thank you very much for returning, and I hope you'll come back. We're going to continue with our pursuit of Marilyn Monroe's life, And I have other books up my sleeve and other ideas. I have another crime to talk about this week. And in the meantime, slán go fóill, sláinte.